Hey, what's up, guys? Welcome back to the Mana Fix. So today we're going to talk about Ezuri, Stalker of Spheres. This is a newer commander from Phyrexia, All Will Be One. Now, I've been hearing some people say that this Azuri is just like the last Azuri, but worse. I don't think that's necessarily fair. Well, it might be worse based on just overall power level. It's also just different. It does something different than Ezuri Claw of Progress did. So what this one does is it's a 3/3 Phyrexian Elf Warrior for 1 green, 1 blue, and 2 other. He says whenever you proliferate, draw a card. But he also has this other ability where when he enters the battlefield, we can pay 3 additional generic mana to proliferate twice. So this entire deck is just going to be based around the Proliferate mechanic. We're going to run cards like Thrumming Bird. We're going to run cards like Contagion Clasp. We're going to run a whole bunch of Proliferate in here so that we're always drawing cards and drawing into more cards that will allow us to proliferate more, and on and on and on. But of course, if you're proliferating, you need counters on your permanents. So we're going to run a bunch of +1/+1 counter stuff as well. So let's take a look at the deck and see what it can do. As usual, let's start with our ramp cards, and we're going to be running mostly creatures here as they give us more targets for our +1/+1 counters. Llanowar Elves, Elvish Mystic, Fiend Horn Elves, and Birds of Paradise are all 1-cost mana dorks that fit the ramp role very nicely. Staples like Sakura Tribe Elder, Nature's Lore, and 3 Visits are all here because land ramp for 2 mana is hard to pass up, especially when we're running a 4-cost commander that will be playable by turn 3 after casting one of these. Emergent Sequence also fills this role but has an added benefit. The land we search for is going to enter the battlefield with a number of +1/+1 counters on it equal to the number of lands that entered the battlefield this turn. So worst case scenario, that's going to be 1 counter, but more likely it's going to be 2. So not only is this ramping us, but it's also giving us a creature with counters that we can target with Proliferate later on. Speaking of counters, Gyre Sage is going to be a great ramp card in this deck. It's a 1/2 with Evolve, so whenever a creature with greater power or toughness enters the battlefield, it gets a +1/+1 counter. Then it taps for an amount of green mana equal to the number of counters on it. This can get totally out of control in the mid to late game. Biophagus is another fantastic card in this deck. It's another 2-cost mana dork, but when we tap it for mana, if that mana is spent on a creature, the creature enters with an additional +1/+1 counter, which plays into our theme very nicely. Everflowing Chalice is an interesting addition. This is a 0-cost artifact with a multi-kicker. For each 2 generic mana we spend to cast this, it gets a charge counter. It taps for an amount of colorless mana equal to the number of charge counters on it. Most of the time we'll just pay 2 mana to cast this, but then we'll use our Proliferate triggers to add charge counters to it so that it starts to tap for more and more mana over the course of the game. One ramp card that fits very well into the theme here is Kodama of the West Tree. With this out, all of our creatures with counters on them will gain trample. Also, whenever one of those creatures deals combat damage to an opponent, we get to search for a basic land and put it on tapped. If we have multiple creatures with +1/+1 counters out, along with Kodama, our ramp is going to be out of control. And then finally, we have Replicating Ring, which is probably the most unconventional ramp card in this deck, but also one of my favorites. It costs 3 mana, so it's a bit more than the other options in this deck, but at the beginning of our upkeep, we put a night counter on it. Then, if it has 8 or more night counters, we create 8 copies of it. And what's nice about Replicating Ring in this deck is that we don't have to wait around for 8 turns for this thing to pop off, because we're going to be adding counters to it whenever we proliferate too, not just at our upkeep. So let's talk about Proliferate. Yes, our commander can proliferate, but realistically we need 7 total mana to do that with him. 4 to cast him normally, and then the 3 additional mana to proliferate twice when he enters. So we're going to want other ways to proliferate. Contagion Clasp and Contagion Engine both have activated abilities that allow us to proliferate. When Contagion Clasp enters, we get to put a -1/-1 counter on a creature. And then it also has an ability where we can pay 4 mana and tap it to proliferate. Although more expensive, Contagion Engine puts a -1/-1 counter on each creature one of our opponents controls, as opposed to just one creature. The activated ability on this one also has the same activation cost, but allows us to proliferate twice. Another thing that I love about these two cards is the fact that we can proliferate at instant speed, which might allow us to catch an opponent off guard from time to time. Evolution Sage and Flux Channeler are also going to provide plenty of proliferate triggers. Evolution Sage will trigger whenever a land enters under our control, and Flux Channeler will trigger whenever we cast a non-creature spell. Inexorable Tide is similar but even better, as it proliferates for us whenever we cast any spell, not just non-creature spells. Thrumming Bird and Bloated Contaminator both proliferate when they deal combat damage to a player. Thrumming Bird is just a 1/1 with flying, but for 2 mana, and that's solid value. Bloated Contaminator is a new card from Phyrexia All Will Be One. It's a 4/4 with trample, so already it has excellent value for a 3 mana creature, but on top of that it also has Toxic 1, so whenever it deals combat damage to a player, it also gives that player 1 poison counter. Next up we have Sword of Truth and Justice. This is a 3 mana equipment card with an equip cost of 2 that gives the equipped creature +2/+2 and pro white and blue. But the important thing about this card is that when the creature deals combat damage to a player, we get to put a +1/+1 counter on a creature and proliferate. And now we have several newer cards, starting with Tainted Observer. This has flying and Toxic 1, but it also has a triggered ability where we can pay 2 mana whenever a creature enters the battlefield under our control to proliferate. Unnatural Restoration and Experimental Augury are both 2 mana spells that proliferate. Unnatural Restoration returns a target permanent card from our graveyard to our hand. Experimental Augury allows us to look at the top 3 cards of our library and put one of them into our hand and the rest on the bottom of our library. Finally, we have Tekethal Inquiry Dominus. This guy is absolutely nuts. With him out, whenever we proliferate, we're actually going to proliferate twice. He also has the ability to gain an indestructible counter by activating that ability. So what are we doing with all those proliferate triggers? Well, naturally, we're going to be building up +1/+1 counters. Tyrannid Prime and Master Biomancer are going to help get the party started. Tyrannid Prime is a 0/4 with Evolve that gives all of our other creatures Evolve too. At 3 mana, this is a fantastic early drop that is sure to give us tons of counters. Master Biomancer can do the same. Any creature that enters with this creature out is going to get a number of +1/+1 counters equal to its power. So the minimum here is 2, but if Master Biomancer himself has counters on him, that number could be even higher. Rishkar Pima Renegade puts a +1/+1 counter on up to 2 creatures when it enters the battlefield. It also turns our creatures with counters on them into mana dorks that tap for green mana. Next up, we have Mana Gorger Hydra and Forgotten Ancient. Both of these creatures have a triggered ability where we get to put a +1/+1 counter on them whenever any player casts a spell. So once these creatures are down, they're going to be triggering all the time. Mana Gorger Hydra is a little bit cheaper at 3 mana, and he has Trample, so it'll be easier to get damage through with him. Forgotten Ancient costs 4 total mana, but he has an extra ability that triggers at our upkeep. When that triggers, we can move any number of +1/+1 counters from him onto other creatures we control. That's going to make it a lot easier for us to go wide and get more damage through. The Great Henge is a staple in a deck like this. This is an artifact that costs 9 total mana, but it'll cost X less, where X is the greatest power among creatures we control. So this will be a lot easier to get out in the late game once we have an established board state. This artifact has a tap ability that adds 2 green mana and gains us 2 life. But the best part about it is that whenever a creature enters under our control, we get to put a +1/+1 counter on it and draw a card. Another card that adds counters to our creatures is Defiler of Vigor. This card can reduce the cost of our green permanent spells by 1 green if we want to pay 2 life to do so. The important part here is that we put a +1/+1 counter on each creature we control whenever we cast one of those green permanent spells. And then we have Simic Ascendancy. This is an enchantment that will put a +1/+1 counter on a creature at the cost of 1 green, 1 blue, and 1 other. But the coolest part about it is the way it acts as an alternative win condition. Whenever we put 1 or more +1/+1 counters on one of our creatures, we put that many growth counters on Simic Ascendancy. Then at our upkeep, if it has 20 or more growth counters on it, we win the game. I know it goes without saying, but our Proliferate triggers can also increase the number of growth counters on this enchantment, making this win condition even more viable than it otherwise would be. Another excellent card in this deck is Champion of Lambhold. Whenever another creature enters under our control, we get to put a +1/+1 counter on this card. It also says that creatures with power less than Champion of Lambhold's power can't block creatures we control. So when we build this thing up by casting creatures, which we're naturally going to do, all of our creatures are essentially going to become unblockable. One creature that's going to be scary if it becomes unblockable is Toothy Imaginary Friend. Toothy gets a +1/+1 counter whenever we draw a card. In this deck, we should be drawing tons of cards because of our commander's ability, so this creature is going to build up really quickly. Then if he leaves the battlefield, we get to draw a card for each +1/+1 counter on him. Speaking of drawing cards, we have Prime Speaker Zagana in this deck too. She's a 1/1 that enters with a number of counters equal to the greatest power among creatures we control. Then when she enters, we draw cards equal to her power. Next, we have Sage of Hours. We can remove all the +1/+1 counters from Sage of Hours, and then when we do, we take an extra turn for each 5 counters we removed. So we're going to want to give this as many counters as we can through cards like Forgotten Ancient, maybe combined with a Doubling Season, for example. And if we're able to give this 5 or more counters every turn, our opponents will never get another turn. So this can even be a win condition. Now we also have the old Ezuri in this deck, Ezuri Claw of Progress. Whenever a creature with power 2 or less enters, we get an experience counter. Then at the beginning of combat, a target creature we control gets a number of +1/+1 counters equal to the number of experience counters we have. If you've ever played an Azuri deck or played against one, you know how quickly this can get out of hand. As I touched on briefly before, Proliferate affects all types of counters, not just +1/+1 counters. For example, we can also increase the number of poison counters our opponents have. Venerated Rot Priest is a new card from Phyrexia All Will Be One. This is a 1-drop with Toxic 1, and then on top of that, it says whenever one of our creatures is targeted with a spell, target player gets a poison counter. This thing just has so much value at 1 mana, it's absurd. Pentad Prism is an interesting one. This enters with the charge counter on it for each color of mana spent to cast it. So most of the time that'll be 2. And then when we remove a charge counter from it, we can add 1 mana of any color. So whenever we proliferate, we can add charge counters to this, and as long as we have at least 1 counter on it, we can continue to use this as a mana source throughout the game. Same goes for Druid's Repository. This one is going to get a lot more counters though because it gets a charge counter whenever a creature we control attacks. We're running a couple Planeswalkers in this deck too. With Teferi, Master of Time, we can activate his abilities on each of our opponent's turns and any time we could cast an instant. So we can activate his +1 to draw and discard a card 4 times per rotation, which is absolutely nuts. Combine that with a little bit of Proliferate and we'll get to that -10 in no time, allowing us to take 2 extra turns. Teferi Temporal Pilgrim has a triggered ability that puts a loyalty counter on him anytime we draw a card. His 0 draws us a card. His -2 gives us a spirit token that gets a +1/+1 counter whenever we draw a card, which directly plays into our theme, and then if we can get to his -12, it's essentially a one-sided board wipe. Now, technically we can win without combos, but what fun would that be if we ran a deck without combos? We just have a couple and they all include Crystalline Crawler. This enters with a +1/+1 counter for each color of mana spent to cast it, so 2. We can also tap it to add a +1/+1 counter to it. Now combine this with Deadeye Navigator and Deep Glow Skate, and we have infinite mana. As long as Crystalline Crawler has 3 or more counters on it, and Deep Glow Skate and Deadeye Navigator are soul bonded, we can pay 2 mana to blink Deep Glow Skate, doubling the number of counters on Crystalline Crawler to 6. We can then remove 2 counters from it to add 2 mana, and use that mana to blink Deep Glow Skate again, this time doubling the number of counters to 8. And we can repeat that over and over again, creating infinite mana. Another combo with Crystalline Crawler involves Hardened Scales and Doubling Season, which by the way are great cards on their own because they'll help us to add even more +1/+1 counters to our creatures. But add in Simic Ascendancy to this and we can win the game. If all of these cards are out, we can pay the 3 mana from Simic Ascendancy to add a +1/+1 counter to Crystalline Crawler. Now we have 2 applicable replacement effects for that. If we choose hardened scales first, well, that will tell us that we have to put 2 +1/+1 counters on the crawler. But we still have one applicable replacement effect available for that in Doubling Season. Doubling Season is going to double those 2 +1/+1 counters to 4 +1/+1 counters. Because we're putting 4 counters on Crystalline Crawler, Simic Ascendancy will trigger, telling us to put 4 growth counters on it, which would be doubled to 8. Now we can remove 3 counters from Crystalline Crawler to pay for Simic Ascendancy again, putting 4 more counters on it and starting this all over again. After 3 activations of Simic Ascendancy, we'll have more than enough growth counters to win the game at our next upkeep. We can also use Purr, Imaginative Rascal, in place of Hardened Scales. And Purr is also a great card on his own, as he's pretty much a Hardened Scales on a creature that affects all types of counters, not just +1/+1 counters. Finally, let's cover the utility lands we're running. We're running both Boseiju, Who Endures, and Otawara, Soaring City. Boseiju can be used to destroy an artifact, enchantment, or non-basic land, and Otawara can be used to return an artifact, creature, enchantment, or planeswalker to its owner's hand. With Novajin, Heart of Progress, we can pay 1 green, 1 blue, and tap it to put a +1/+1 counter on each creature that entered the battlefield this turn. Karn's Bastion is a great land in this deck. Its second ability allows us to proliferate for 4 mana. Mage Ring Network is also great for a proliferate deck. We can pay 1 and tap this to put a storage counter on it. Obviously, those storage counters can then be increased when we proliferate. With that last ability, we can then tap it and remove as many storage counters as we want to add that much colorless mana. Similar to that, we have Saprazin Scary and Hickory Woodlot. I'm sure I butchered that first name, but whatever. So yes, these enter tapped, but they each enter with 2 depletion counters on them. When we add mana with them, we remove a depletion counter from them to add 2 mana of their respective colors. However, if we can continually proliferate to add depletion counters to these so that they never run out, well then we just have lands that tap for 2 as opposed to 1, which is obviously very good. So that's it. Let me know what you thought down in the comments below. Make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you don't miss out on any new deck techs. You can also follow us on Twitter and Instagram using the handles in the description below. And as always, thanks for getting your fix with me today. Stay safe out there. Peace out, guys.